On a bend of the riverway, where the water runs slow and black beneath willows that bow as if in perpetual mourning, stands Blackthorn Manoret's greystone, softened by centuries of rain, its windows like hollow eyes, fixed on a landscape that has forgotten most of what it has seen. The year is 1843, though time seemed already to have stalled within those walls, long before the age of steam touched the outer world. The manor belonged, as it had for over 200 years, to the Ashcombe familia lineage of quiet influence, unremarkable in public affairs, but scrupulously preserved in the annals of county gentry. Its last master, Algernon Ashcombe, was a man of such rigid propriety that even his smiles were said to be measured in degrees, calibrated against the expectations of decorum, rather than any genuine warmth. He lived alone, save for a housekeeper of advanced years, Mrs. Elspeth Cray, whose loyalty bordered on the devotional, and a single manservant who spoke little and vanished without notice in the winter of '42. Visitors were rare, and those who came rarely stayed past tea. The few who did recall an oppressive stillness in the air as though the very dust feared to settle audibly, and a curious absence of mirrors. Only one remained in the west-facing drawing-room, its silvering clouded with age and inexplicably turned toward the wall. Algernon's days followed a pattern so exacting it bordered on ritual. Rise at dawn, take breakfast in silence, walk the perimeter of the estate at precisely 9:10, return to read correspondence that no one ever saw dispatched, and retire before the lamps were lit. Neighbors spoke of hearing no laughter, no arguments, not even the rustle of servants' skirts in the corridors after dusk, yet there was sound so faint as to be dismissed by rational minds, yet persistent enough to haunt the edges of memory. A piano, played with impossible delicacy, from a room where no instrument had stood since the death of Algernon's mother in 1819. The murmur of a child's voice near the nursery wing, though the Ashcombes had produced no offspring in 3 generations. Most disturbing of all were the reports from the village postmaster, who swore that 4 months prior to Algernon's final disappearance, he received letters addressed in the master's own hand, but stamped from no known post office, bearing no date, and sealed with wax, the color of dried blood. These he kept locked in a tin box beneath his counter, too unnerved to deliver them, too superstitious to burn. The manor itself bore the signs of a household, preparing for an end that was not death, but something more deliberate. Cupboards stood half empty, linens folded with unusual care and stored away as if for a journey no one would take. Portraits were removed from their frames, their canvases rolled and tied with black ribbon, while the ancestral Lajora, bound volume of births, marriages, and burials ended abruptly in 1841, with a notation no further issue required. The final entry was not signed, yet the script matched Algernon's precisely. When he was last seen, on the evening of November 3rd, 1843, he wore his mourning coat, though no funeral had been announced, and carried a leather satchel to light, to contain anything of substance. He walked toward the eastern wood, where the river curves into a crescent said by local shepherds to be unnaturally still. No fish leap there, no birds alight. On its banks, he was never seen again, yet the house was not abandoned. Smoke curled from its chimneys for another fortnight, lights flickered in the upper windows, and Mrs. Cray, when questioned by the constable, insisted her master was merely resting and would return when the silence was complete. She died 3 days later of no discernible cause, her lips slightly parted as if caught midwit, her hands folded over a single sheet of paper on which someone, perhaps she, perhaps another, had written in fading ink, "We have kept the vow." The estate passed into the hands of a distant cousin, who sold it within the year, unable to tolerate what he called the weight of absence that clung to every room. Subsequent tenants lasted weeks, rarely. One left behind a diary describing how, on still nights, he could hear footsteps pacing the gallery above his bedroom, not hurried, but slow, patient, as though counting the tiles on the floor. Another claimed the scent of roses bloomed in the hall every minute, though no rosebush had grown on the grounds since the 1790s. By 1870, Blackthorn stood empty, its gates rusted shut, its gardens reclaiming the drive in a slow tide of ivy and bramble. Yet the local folks still averted their eyes when passing it on the road, and mothers hushed their children if they chanced to name it aloud, for the story had begun to circulate not as rumor, but as something nearer to cautionary truth, that the Ashcombes had not merely died out, but chosen to vanish, not from shame or ruin, but from a conviction so absolute it overrode blood, legacy, and even the instinct to be remembered. What drove a family of standing to such a conclusion remains, at first glance, buried beneath the polite fictions of Victorian discretion. But the house, though empty, refused to forget, and in its silence, something waited not for return, but for witness.
Long after the last tenant had fled, and the ivy had begun to pry its fingers between the stones of Blackthorn Manor's facade, certain objects remained curiously preserved, as though the decay of the house paused in their presence. A locked escritoire in the study, its brass fittings untarnished despite the damp. A child's porcelain doll, found seated upright on a windowsill in the east turret, though no child had set foot there in living memory. And most unsettling of all, a set of 8 silver-framed again, discovered in a cedar chest beneath the floorboards of the nursery, each depicting a different Ashcombe from the late 1700s, onward every face, expression, every gaze directed just beyond the camera's lens, as if observing something just outside the frame. These were not the usual stiff, formal portraits of the age. There was a peculiar quality to the eyes, a depth that seemed to shift under lamplight, as though the subjects had been captured not in life, but in a moment of profound listening. When the chest was opened by a curious groundskeeper in 1868, the air in the room reportedly grew cold enough to fog his breath, and the scent of rosewater sharp and sweet rose from the wood, like an exhalation long held. He reburied the chest that same night, muttering to his wife that some names ought never be spoken above a whisper. The Ashcombe papers, those that survive dispersal and fire, tell a story not of decline but of retreat, a slow, methodical withdrawal from the world, documented in ledgers whose entries grow increasingly sparse, then cryptic, then cease altogether. From 1801 onward, there are no marriage contracts, no christening records, no estate expansions. Instead, one finds repeated notations concerning the observance, the sealing, and the silence. A receipt from a London apothecary, dated 1823, lists white poppy, mandrake root, and vervine, purchased by Lady Eleanor Ash, mother whose own death certificate cites melancholia of prolonged duration, though private journal recovered from a Soho second-hand bookseller in 1891 adds, in cramped marginalia. Patient insisted the house was breathing, and that she must not answer. More troubling still are the letters exchanged between Algernon and his uncle, Reverend Alistair Ashcombe, rector of St. Cephildradas in Wil. These were found bound in black twine inside a false panel behind the manor's hearth in 1880 by a surveyor assessing the property for demolition. Most are mundane discussions of crop yields. Church, repair spot 3, written in the final year of the Reverend's life, carry a tone that veers sharply from pastoral concern into something resembling dread. You speak of finality as though it were virtue, one reads, but blood does not consent to its own erasure. It remembers. It calls. Another, stained with what appears to be wax, but smells faintly of iron, ends with a single sentence underlined twice. If you proceed, do not expect the door to close behind you. The Reverend was found dead in his vestry 2 weeks later, slumped over a Bible open to the Book of Ruth, though his fingers clutched a page of blank parchment. Local testimonies, gathered decades later by folklorists and provincial historians, offer fragments that resist easy reconciliation. Old Martha Henshaw, who delivered linens to Blackthorn until 8, recalled that no mirrors were allowed in the house after the little master vanished. A boy whose existence appears nowhere in official records, yet whose name, Edmund, surfaces twice in Algernon's private account books beside the notation expenses settled in full. A shepherd named Thomas Bell swore that, on Midsummer's Eve of 18, he saw candlelight moving between the manor's upper windows in a pattern that mimicked the Ashcombe family crest, though the house had been declared unoccupied for months. The village schoolmaster, Mr. Pembroke, kept a journal in which he noted that for 3 successive winters the snow around Blackthorn would melt in concentric circles, as though heat radiated from the earth below, but only on the nights when the moon was new. Most compelling, however, is the testimony of Miss Clara Vane, a distant relation, who briefly stayed at the manor in 1837 while recovering from a nervous complaint. Her diary, published posthumously in 1899 under the title Whispers Among the Yews, describes how she awoke each night at precisely 2:17 a.m. to the sound of a music box playing a simple, looping melody she could never quite place. When she asked Mrs. Cray about it, the housekeeper merely replied, "It belongs to the quiet ones," and refused to speak of it again. Clara later wrote that she never heard the tune outside Blackthorn but that in dreams. It still played slower each time, as though winding down toward a final, silent click. Even the architecture conspired in the mystery. Floor plans from the 1760s show a west wing that no longer exists, its space now occupied by a seamless stretch of wainscoting and bookshelves. Though infrared surveys conducted in 1903 by a curious engineer from the Royal Society revealed the ghostly outline of doorways and corridors beneath the plaster, when investigators attempted to drill into the wall, their instruments jammed inexplicably, and one man reported hearing, through the handle of his screwdriver, a faint tapping, not random, but rhythmic. As if in more, the work was abandoned. More subtili, the acoustics of the grand hall defied physics. A whisper spoken at the far end could be heard with unnatural clarity by someone standing near the fireplace, while loud voices seemed to be absorbed by the air itself. Visitors described the sensation of being overheard by the house not watched, but listened to, as though every footfall and breath were being catalogued by walls that had long since ceased to distinguish between the living and the gong. All these fragments, objects, testimonies, architectural anomalies point not to madness, but to a coherence so deliberated borders on design. The Ashcombes did not simply vanish. They engineered their absence with the same precision they once applied to estate management and social standing. But to what end? And who or what were they silencing, not just from the world, but from themselves? The answer, if it exists, lies not in the documents alone, but in the silence between them, in the spaces where ink refuses to settle and memory grows thin. The true unraveling of the Ashcombe enigma began not with a scholar or a ghost hunter, but with a quiet, meticulous clerk from the diocesan archives in Winchester, Mr. Edmund Price, a man whose life had been shaped more by ledgers than by legend, yet whose curiosity proved fatal to his peace of mind. In 1887, while cataloguing forgotten parish records displaced by a church restoration, Price encountered a reference to Black Manor in a bundle of unindexed ecclesiastical correspondence dating from 1798. It concerned a petition submitted by Sir Reginald Ashcombe, great-grandfather of Algernon, requesting a private dispensation from the Bishop of Salisbury to observe certain ancestral rites without interference from the established church. The petition was denied, with a notation in the bishop's hand: "No such rites have standing in canon law, nor shall they be tolerated under guise of family tradition." Yet appended to the file was a later affidavit from the same bishop, dated 2 months after the refusal, retracting his opposition in terms so vague and deferential as to suggest coercion or fear. Upon further reflection, it read, "The matter appears to pertain not to doctrine, but to lineage, and thus lies beyond the scope of ecclesiastical jurisdiction." Price, intrigued by the abrupt reversal, began tracing the Ashcombe line through wills, baptismal registers, and land deeds. What he found was a pattern not of eccentricity, but of erasure. Entire branches of the family tree pruned with surgical precision, names omitted from memorials, graves unmarked or relocated without record. His research led him to the county where he uncovered a sealed deposition from 1811 involving a servant girl who had worked at Blackthorn for less than a fortnight before fleeing in terror, though the document was heavily redacted. Fragments survived. Saw the master pour water from the well into a silver bowl at midnight. The reflection did not match his face, and later heard them singing in the chapel, though no one was there but the lady and the child who is not. The girl was declared hysterical and dismissed, but Price noted that the magistrate who heard the case, Sir Lionel Gravis, never accepted another appointment in that district and retired abruptly to the continent within the year. Price also tracked down the diary of Dr. Ainsworth, the family physician from 1805 to 1822, which had passed through 3 private hands before surfacing at a Guildford estate sale. In it, The doctor described visiting Blackthorn on repeated occasions to treat nervous afflictions that afflicted successive Ashcombe heirs, all of whom reported the same symptoms: insomnia preceded by the sensation of being called by name in a voice familiar yet followed by a compulsion to remain absolutely silent for days at a time. Most disturbing was an entry from October 1819, in which Ainsworth wrote, "Lady Eleanor insisted I examine the west wing, though I knew it had been sealed since '03. There I found no dust, no decay, only a single chair facing an empty space, and upon the seat a pair of child's shoes. Still warm, ad death. In a trembling hand I shall not return. Some doors, once opened, cannot be closed by human will alone." Price's investigations deepened into obsession. He spent nights cross-referencing birth records with burial registers, noting that for every Ashcombe born between 1750 and 1840, there was a corresponding death but rarely a christening, and never a marriage license issued within the county. The family seemed to reproduce, then immediately withdraw, as though progeny were not a continuation but a necessary step toward termination. He discovered that the Ashcombe vault in the village churchyard contained only 3 coffins, though the lineage spanned over a dozen generations. When he petitioned for a discreet exhumation in 18, citing public health concerns over possible structural instability, he was granted reluctant permission. What the sexton found, or rather, failed to find a fide explanation: the coffins were empty. Not looted, but pristine, their interiors lined with silk that bore no signs of decomposition. Yet the nameplates were correct, the dates accurate. Price, standing in the damp crypt with his lantern, later wrote in his private journal that the air smelled of dried roses and old parchment, and that for a moment he heard a child humming the same tune Clara Vane had described decades earlier. He left the vault and never entered a church again. His notes from this period grow increasingly fragmented, the handwriting shifting from neat copperplate to a cramped, almost frantic scrawl. He began collecting objects associated with the family, not just documents, but buttons, shards of glass, even soil from the manor's garden, storing them in a locked cabinet in his study, which he lined with lead sheeting to muffle the resonance. Neighbors reported seeing his lights burn until dawn, and that he spoke aloud to no one, yet often paused as if listening to a reply. In one margin, he jotted, "They are not ghosts. Ghosts linger. These have gone but left the echo so loud it drowns the present." Another page bears only a single sentence, circled thrice. The vow was not to die, but to cease being heard. By 1893, Price had ceased publishing, ceased attending academic meetings, and ceased answering letters. When his landlady finally entered his rooms after weeks of silence, she found him seated at his desk, eyes open, hands folded over a single sheet of paper on which he had written, in perfect calligraphy, the Ashcombe family motto secut, Umbra sum. "We are as shadows," followed by a postscript in his own hand. "And shadows do not speak unless spoken to. But I have spoken, and now they answer." He was declared to have died of apoplexy. The cabinet was removed and burned by order of the landlord, who claimed the wood screamed when the axe struck. Yet, before his death, Price had sent a sealed parcel to the British Museum, marked to be opened only after 50 years. It contained maps, transcripts, and a small, rusted key stamped with the Ashcombe crest. The museum, uncertain of its provenance, stored it in a basement vault. There it remained, forgotten, until a junior archivist in 1948, prompted by a dream of rosewater and ticking clocks, dug it out during a routine inventory. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was a handwritten codex titled The Book of Unbinding, its pages filled not with invocations, but with genealogies, dates, and meticulous annotations concerning the final silence. The last entry, dated November 4th, 1843, the day after Algernon Ashcombe disappeared. Simply, "The line is closed. The door is shut. Let no voice follow."
It was this very codex's paper, brittle as moth wings, its ink faded to the color of dusk, that drew Dr. Ellen O'Hara to Black Manor in the autumn of 1951. A historian of Victorian esoterica at Girton College, Dr. Harrow had built her reputation on dissecting the intersection of social propriety and occult practice, but she approached the Ashcombe case not as a scholar of the supernatural, but as a student of silence. She believed that what frightened the Victorians most was not the presence of the otherworld, but the absence of the expected. The unattended cradle, the unworn wedding ring, the unbroken fast. In the Ashcombe archive, she saw not a haunting, but a performance of a racer meticulously staged, culturally intelligible, and yet profoundly alien in its totality, armed with Price's parcel, county records, and the reluctant cooperation of the current landowner, reclusive and who demanded she sign a waiver absolving him of any auditory or mnemonic disturbances. She arrived at the manor on a morning thick with mist, the kind that clings to stone like breath held too long. What remained of Blackthorn was skeletal, the roof half collapsed, floors rotted through, yet certain rooms stood oddly intact, as though time had hesitated in their thresholds. The drawing room, though stripped of furniture, still bore the ghostly rectangle on the wall where the solitary mirror had once hung. The library's shelves, though empty, emitted the faint scent of camphor and dried lavender when the wind shifted east. Dr. Harrow set up her camp in the former conservatory, a glassless frame of iron and ivywork. She catalogued her findings by lamplight, her typewriter clicking into the stillness like a metronome counting down to something unseen. She was methodical, almost clinical, in her approach, photographing floor plans, comparing them to 18th century schematics, testing acoustics with calibrated tuning forks, yet even she could not deny the anomalies that defied instrumentation. Her barometer registered sudden drops in pressure with no corresponding weather change. Her tape recorder, left running overnight in the grand hall, captured only static except on 3 occasions, when a faint, lilting melody emerged from the hiss, identical to the one described by Clara Vane and Edmund Price. When played back at half speed, it resolved into a child's voice, whispering a single phrase in Latin, non hispandemic, we do not answer. Her most significant discovery came not from documents, but from the land itself. While examining the overgrown courtyard, she noticed that the flagstones formed a pattern invisible from ground level, spiral converging on a central stone carved with the Ashcombe crest, partially buried beneath centuries of leaf mold. Beneath it, using Price's rusted key which fit no visible lock but, when pressed into a fissure in the stone, triggered a soft click, she found a narrow shaft descending into the earth. The air that rose from it was dry and cool, carrying the unmistakable scent of rose petals and beeswax. Descending with a miner's lamp, she found a circular chamber, its walls lined with shelves holding hundreds of small, lead-sealed cylinders. Each bore a name and date every Ashcombe heir from 1692 onward. Inside, not ashes or relics, but tightly wound spools of fine silk thread, dyed in subtle gradations of crimson. Attached to each was a slip of vellum, inscribed with a single word, Vaux's voice. She understood then. The Ashcombes had not merely refused to speak, they had ritually surrendered their voices, their names, their very resonance. Spool by spool, generation by generation, in a ceremony of ontological surrender, the final cylinder, labeled Algernon Ashcombe, 1843, was empty. This revelation altered the tenor of her work. She ceased attempting to explain and began to listen. She spent nights in the West Wing not out of bravado, but in deference to the architecture of absence. She noted that her dreams grew lucid, populated by figures who never turned their faces toward her, but walked always just ahead, their footsteps soundless on floors that should have groaned. She wrote in her journal that the house does not haunt, it mourns itself. Her colleagues, receiving her sporadic letters, grew concerned. Her prose, once precise and detached, now carried a lyrical unease. There is a kind of silence that is not the absence of sound, but the presence of something that has chosen not to be heard. To stand within it is to feel the weight of all that has been unsaid, unremembered, and to wonder if memory itself is a form of violation. She began leaving offerings, not candles or prayers, but small tokens of acknowledgement. A pressed rose, a blank page, a single silver coin placed on the central stone. She claimed they vanished by morning, though no footprints disturbed the dust. By the winter of 1952, Dr. Harrow had stopped sending reports altogether. When a graduate student, worried by her silence, visited the manor in March, she found the conservatory abandoned typewriter covered in frost, notebooks neatly stacked, teacups still half full, though the liquid had long since frozen and sublimated. Of Dr. Harrow, there was no trace, but on the desk lay a new entry in her journal, dated the night before the solstice. I understand now. They did not fear death. They feared echo. To be spoken of, even in hushed tones, is to be summoned back into the noise of the world. So they cut the thread not of life, but of resonance, and in doing so, they made silence their sanctuary. I hear them now, not as voices, but as the space between notes, and I will not name them again. The final page contained only a sketch, a door, slightly ajar, with no handle on the outer side. Beneath it, a single line. Some vows are kept by forgetting. No one has lived at Blackthorn Manor since the winter of 1952. The land remains privately held, though the deed is registered to a trust with no named beneficiaries. Only a clause stipulating that the property shall remain undisturbed, unrecorded, and unnamed in public instruments. The local council, weary of liability and strange complaints from trespassers, a teenager who claimed the trees whispered his childhood nickname, a surveyor who suffered temporary aphasia after spending an hour in the courtyard, has allowed the manor to sink further into the earth, its ruins now half swallowed by brambles and elder. Yet the story persists, not in newspapers or scholarly journals, but in the quiet corners of village memory, in the way certain families still refuse to walk the old road after dusk, and in the hushed instruction given to children. If you hear music where no one is playing, do not hum along. What was the vow that compelled the Ashcombes to sever their lineage so utterly? No document states it outright, but from the fragments, the silk spools, the empty coffins, the recurring motif of unmarried roomsit, becomes clear that their ritual was not one of summoning, but of unmaking. They believed that to be remembered was to be bound, that every spoken name, every recorded birth, every painted portrait tethered the soul to the wheel of echo. And so, generation by generation, they practiced a slow dissolution, first withdrawing from society, then from speech, then from memory itself. The child's shoes found warm in the west wing. The phantom piano, the letters mailed from Noworthies, were not haunt, but residues. The faint tremors of a presence, striving not to be felt. The final act of Algren and Ashcombe was not suicide, but completion. He did not end his life. He ended his reverberation, and in doing so, he fulfilled what his ancestors had begun, a bloodline that chose to vanish not into death, but into perfect silence. There are those who insist the Ashcombes still exist not as spirits, but as absences that shape the world around them. A historian at the Bodleian once noted that whenever the manor is mentioned in academic circles, microfilm reels jam, digital archives glitch, and footnotes on the subject tend to vanish from proofs between typesetting and printing. In 1989, a television crew attempting a documentary on forgotten English manors filmed exterior footage of Blackthorn at dawn. When developed, every frame containing the house was inexplicably fogged except one, in which the central window of the west wing shows a silhouette, not of a person, but of negative space, as though something had stepped out of the film itself. The reel was destroyed by order of the producer, who later admitted, in a private letter, that he could not bear the silence that filled the room when the footage played. Not the absence of sound, but the sound of absence. Today, the only consistent witness is the wind. On still nights, when the river mist rises and curls around the ruins like breath, residents of the nearest hamlet report a sound that is neither music nor voice, but something older. The soft, rhythmic unwinding of thread. It lasts only a few seconds, then stops. No one has ever traced its source. Those who have stood at the edge of the Blackthorn Drive at such moments describe an overwhelming urge to turn back, not out of fear, but out of respect, as though to proceed would be to interrupt the private ceremony of vanishing that has been underway for centuries, and sometimes Just before dawn, when the world is caught between sleep and waking, a visitor might pause on the road and swear they see, in the cracked glass of a remaining window, a reflection that is not their own. It shows only an empty room, a single chair, and on the floor before it, a small pair of shoes, damp with dew, as if just removed. But when they blink, it is gone. The glass reflects only the gray sky, the skeletal trees, the slow creep of ivy across stone, and the silence returns, deeper than before,